From April 14 to 18, 2025, Chinese President Xi Jinping began his diplomatic tour in Vietnam, right in the midst of the US-China trade war tensions. Under the slogan, "A community with a shared future," Xi held talks with General Secretary To Lam, urging Hanoi to stand against unilateralism, a clear jab at President Trump's tariffs, in an attempt to pull Vietnam into an anti-US alliance. However, just days later, Vietnam swiftly pivoted, showing flexibility and goodwill towards Washington. Did Xi leave empty-handed? Vietnam has always had to skillfully balance between its influential neighbor, China, and its top strategic partner, the United States. In this geopolitical chess game, which side will Hanoi lean towards, and how will that choice impact Beijing's ambitions in the region? To uncover the strategies behind these diplomatic moves and what the future holds for Vietnam-China-US relations, don't miss the in-depth analysis in the video right after this. A glamorous but superficial diplomatic visit. Compared to his visit in December 2023, President Xi Jinping received a significantly higher level of reception during this trip to Vietnam. Last time, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh welcomed him at the airport and National Assembly Chairman Vuong Dinh Hue saw him off. This year, the protocol was elevated with President Luong Quang personally greeting Xi and the Prime Minister bidding farewell. Clearly, Hanoi demonstrated respect and goodwill towards Beijing, especially in light of the 75th anniversary of Vietnam-China diplomatic relations. Beyond formalities, the number of signed agreements also rose notably, from 37 in 2023 to 45 this year, suggesting more comprehensive outcomes. However, most agreements reflected unilateral concessions from China, such as investments in railways and AI technology exports, while Vietnam contributed little in terms of resources. This led many experts to view these deals as largely symbolic, lacking substantive and balanced cooperation. As with previous visits, both sides continued to sidestep sensitive issues like the South China Sea disputes, a perpetual ticking time bomb in bilateral relations. Once again, Hanoi and Beijing chose the safe path, focusing on economic ties and cultural exchanges, avoiding core conflicts. Despite setting records in diplomatic protocol and the number of agreements signed, Xi Jinping's visit did not signal a strategic shift towards China, as appearances might suggest. The highlight was the launch of the Vietnam-China Railway Cooperation Mechanism, a long-anticipated project. Vietnam's National Assembly had already fast-tracked the necessary legislation, making this launch more of a confirmation than a breakthrough. In aviation, Vietjet, Vietnam's second-largest airline, is set to operate Chinese-made Comac passenger aircraft on domestic routes. While this move drew international media attention amid a market dominated by Boeing and Airbus, it remains largely symbolic and does not alter Vietnam's aviation landscape. However, shortly after the grand reception, record-breaking agreements, and joint declarations against hegemonism, Vietnam quickly signaled flexibility towards Washington. Just 3 days after Xi's visit, on April 18th, during a meeting with Warburg Pincus CEO Jeffrey Pearlman, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh emphasized that Vietnam and the U.S. share a special bond, unlike any other relationship. He highlighted Vietnam's proactive steps in reducing tariffs and increasing imports from the U.S., showing goodwill amid ongoing negotiations to avoid the shocking 46% tariffs proposed by President Trump's administration. Furthermore, international media reported that Hanoi is preparing to purchase at least 24 F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jets from the U.S., the largest defense deal between the two countries since the U.S. lifted its arms embargo on Vietnam in 2016. According to 1945, Vietnamese officials typically respond to questions about advanced fighter jet purchases by saying it's a sensitive topic, as it could impact relations with other regional countries, especially China. Reuters revealed that negotiations for the F-16s quietly began during former President Joe Biden's visit to Vietnam in 2023, when U.S.-Vietnam relations reached their highest level in history. Currently, Vietnam's Air Force mainly relies on Russian Su-27 and Su-30 Mk2V aircraft. Acquiring F-16s would not only diversify Vietnam's military assets and reduce dependence on Russia, but also position Vietnam as the fifth country in the Asia-Pacific to own this modern fighter jet. In summary, despite the fanfare and a flurry of agreements, Xi Jinping's visit was more of a diplomatic showcase than a genuine strategic shift. Hanoi remains steadfast in its bamboo diplomacy, leveraging benefits from China without compromising national sovereignty, while maintaining its partnership with the U.S. as a cornerstone for Vietnam's future growth and prosperity. Rare earths, Vietnam's strategic weapon. Vietnam holds 22 million tons of rare earth reserves, ranking second in the world after China's 44 million tons, according to the USGS. This is more than just a resource. It's a geopolitical card that has sparked fierce competition between the US and China to win Hanoi's favor. Rare earths. A group of 17 elements like neodymium and praseodymium are the lifeblood of high technology, semiconductors, military radar systems, and electric vehicle batteries. As of 2023, China controls 63% of global mining and 85% of processing, maintaining a near monopoly. With its vast reserves and strategic location in Southeast Asia, Vietnam stands as a potential counterbalance. The U.S. has ramped up investments, such as Blackstone Minerals' $400 million project, aiming to build an independent supply chain. Meanwhile, China has proposed joint ventures in mining, a move widely seen as an attempt to prevent Vietnam from becoming a competitor. If Vietnam develops an independent rare earth industry, China risks losing its dominant position. A self-reliant Vietnam could supply 10–15% of global demand, driving down prices and threatening billions in Chinese exports. For the U.S., which struggled after China's 2023 rare earth export ban in retaliation for Washington's 145% tariffs, Vietnam would become a lifeline. A stable supply from Hanoi would secure production of F-35 fighter jets, Tesla electric vehicles, and wind turbines, freeing America from Beijing's grip. With its rare earths, Vietnam is not just a supplier, it's a power broker shaping the global landscape. As the U.S.-China trade war escalates, rare earths have become a razor-sharp weapon. China's latest export ban has already driven neodymium prices up by 30% on international markets, pressuring American supply chains. Yet this tactic also worries Beijing. If Vietnam expands production using Western technology, China's market share could shrink rapidly. The U.S., on the other hand, is ready to pour billions into turning Vietnam into a new rare earth hub, not just for economic reasons, but as a matter of national security. Standing at the crossroads, Hanoi is leveraging its rare earth reserves to force concessions from both superpowers, transforming resources into geopolitical power. Is Vietnam closer to the U.S. or China? In reality, Vietnam's response is hardly surprising. In recent years, Hanoi has consistently pursued a bamboo diplomacy strategy, flexible and resilient like bamboo, ready to cooperate with all nations without aligning with any bloc or choosing sides. Vietnam's establishment of comprehensive strategic partnerships with the U.S., China, and Russia clearly reflects this stance. As a leading industrial and assembly hub in Southeast Asia, Vietnam maintains tightly interwoven interests with both global powers. It's no coincidence that Xi Jinping chose Vietnam as the first stop on his inaugural overseas trip in 2025. Hanoi is the strategic piece both Washington and Beijing are vying for. China remains Vietnam's largest trading partner, with both nations governed by communist parties and sharing deep economic ties. Meanwhile, the U.S. is Vietnam's top export market, playing a vital role in the country's economic growth. This delicate balance was tested when the U.S. imposed a 46% retaliatory tariff to block China from laundering origins through third countries, a move that immediately placed Vietnam in a difficult position. For years, Vietnam has served as a key transshipment point for Chinese goods avoiding tariffs. Since 2017, Vietnam's imports from China and exports to the U.S. have been nearly equivalent. According to Vietnam Customs, imports from China reached $144 billion last year, while exports to the U.S. totaled $136 billion, a close ratio that continued into Q1 this year. More critical for Vietnam, however, are the ongoing tariff negotiations with the U.S. Unlike China's hardline stance, Vietnam responded to news of the 46% tariffs by immediately announcing tariff reductions for U.S. goods and reaching out to President Trump for further talks. This highlights that the outcome of negotiations with the U.S. is pivotal to Vietnam's core interests. If Hanoi can convince Washington to lower tariffs to 20 to 30%, it would avoid an economic shock, bolster investor confidence, and reinforce Vietnam's image as a stable, U.S.-friendly nation. Failure, however, could see Vietnam lose its manufacturing edge to rivals like Bangladesh or India, triggering capital flight, production slowdowns, and rising unemployment. A serious challenge amid political sensitivity following To Lam's appointment as General Secretary. To Lam must solidify his position through reforms and economic achievements ahead of the 14th Party Congress in 2026. For Vietnam's leadership, these trade talks are more than diplomacy. They're a test of internal stability and future power. On the other hand, despite Trump's heavy-handed pressure, the U.S. doesn't want to push Vietnam entirely into China's orbit. While Trump has publicly accused Vietnam and China of conspiring against America, much of this is negotiation tactics. Washington understands that forcing Vietnam too far could jeopardize U.S. strategic interests in Southeast Asia. Therefore, a compromise, balancing cooperation with leverage, seems likely. As the U.S.-China trade war intensifies, analysts predict Vietnam will continue its signature balancing act, skillfully navigating between the two giants to protect national interests while maintaining proactive neutrality. Moreover, Hanoi appears more confident in talks with Beijing, with Vietnamese state media reducing portrayals of China as a big brother dictating to Vietnam. A clear example is Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinn's swift response to Trump's call, pledging to crack down on origin fraud, tighten export inspections to the U.S., and penalize violators. On April 18th, a woman from Shenzhen shared on Xiaohongshu how her company's shipment from its Vietnamese factory was unexpectedly held by customs, with over 2,000 semi-finished products inspected and ultimately sent back for discrepancies. Vietnam also pledged cooperation with U.S. Customs, sharing data and assisting investigations into Chinese companies, even providing a list of offending businesses. This decisive move strikes at the heart of China's origin laundering strategy. If other nations follow Vietnam's lead, Chinese goods, whether direct or rerouted, could face significant barriers. Commentator Zhou Xiaohui wrote in Epoch Times that Vietnam is fully aware of its advantageous negotiating position. For future cooperation, China may have to open its wallet, boosting investments, aid, and possibly making concessions on territorial and maritime disputes. Given its tight economic ties with China, Vietnam is unlikely to sever relations entirely. However, with its flexible bamboo diplomacy, Hanoi will avoid getting too close to Beijing, especially as Trump ramps up efforts to contain China. How will China survive this trade war? History shows Beijing has spent hundreds of billions supporting Vietnam, Cambodia, and neighbors to maintain influence. Under growing economic pressure, Xi Jinping is likely to continue using financial incentives and projects to sway regional countries. But will this tactic still work as Southeast Asian nations prioritize pragmatism and national interests? How will Xi adapt his economic playbook to counter tightening U.S.-led pressure? Let's stay tuned for the next moves in this high-stakes geopolitical chess match. Thank you for watching. If you found this topic intriguing, don't forget to share this video so more people can stay updated on the latest developments in this heated international arena.